There's a particular kind of person who walks into a room and immediately begins rearranging it. Not the furniture, the people. They'll watch someone feed their child and quietly mention they've read that screen time before age 2 causes developmental delays. They'll overhear a colleague mention a headache, and within 40 seconds have pulled up an article about magnesium deficiency. They'll learn that a friend is considering a career change, and before that friend has even finished the sentence, they're already explaining why the timing is wrong, the market is difficult, and have they considered staying put for another year? Nobody asked, but somehow that never registers. Here's what most people assume about this behavior: that it's arrogance, that these are people who simply believe they know better, who enjoy the sound of their own expertise, who get some quiet satisfaction from watching others absorb their wisdom. And sometimes that's partially true. But anyone who's studied the deeper psychology of chronic unsolicited advisors knows the real story is far more complicated and far more human than arrogance alone. Because this isn't primarily about knowing, it's about controlling. And controlling isn't about power, it's about fear. The person who cannot stop offering guidance they were never asked to give is almost never someone whose inner world feels stable, ordered, and secure. Quite the opposite. Psychologists who study what's sometimes called externalized anxiety, the tendency to project internal chaos outward onto manageable external targets, describe a consistent pattern. The more overwhelming someone's internal experience feels, the more urgently they need to impose order on the world around them. Other people's problems become solvable puzzles precisely because their own feel unsolvable. This is what makes it so hard to see from the outside. The unsolicited advice looks like confidence. It presents itself as competence, as generosity, as simple helpfulness. But underneath the performance of knowing, there's usually a nervous system quietly drowning. And the only life preserver available is the sensation of being useful, being needed, being the one who sees what others cannot. Researcher Harriet Lerner, in her work on anxiety and relationship dynamics, identified how individuals with unresolved internal distress frequently shift their focus toward fixing others as an unconscious coping mechanism. It's not manipulation in the deliberate sense. It's dysregulation in disguise. The brain routes overwhelming emotion into the one channel that offers temporary relief, the feeling of control. And here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. The content of the advice almost never matters. It's rarely really about the parenting technique or the financial decision or the medical symptom. The specific subject is almost interchangeable. What matters, what the nervous system is actually seeking, is the sensation that comes when someone else receives the guidance. That brief moment of nodding or hesitating, or even pushing back. Because even pushback is engagement. Even conflict is contact. And contact, for someone whose inner world feels frighteningly unsteady, is regulation. This is what psychologists sometimes call the caretaker's paradox. The person who is most aggressive about tending to others is frequently the person most terrified of tending to themselves. Their generosity, and they do experience it as generosity, is genuine at the surface level. They truly believe they are helping. Not because they lack empathy, because they've never been taught to direct that same relentless attention inward. Think about where this pattern typically originates. Research suggests it takes root in environments where love was conditional on performance, where a child learned that worth was demonstrated through usefulness, where being the one who fixed things, anticipated needs, solved problems, kept the family functioning. That was how safety was earned. Their helpfulness wasn't a personality trait. It was a survival strategy. And the nervous system doesn't easily retire strategies that once kept it alive. So decades later, they're still scanning, still assessing, still identifying problems and offering solutions. Because somewhere in the architecture of their earliest experiences, that behavior was the bridge between belonging and abandonment. But here's what nobody tells you about this dynamic. The advice itself is rarely the real wound. The real wound is what it communicates beneath the surface. When someone consistently volunteers guidance that wasn't requested, they are, without knowing it, transmitting a message that the other person cannot be trusted to figure it out, that their judgment is insufficient, that they need supervision. Over time, Even the most patient recipient begins to absorb that message. Not consciously, not dramatically, but slowly, in the accumulated weight of 100 small corrections, 100 unrequested opinions, 100 moments where their own instincts were quietly overridden by someone else's certainty. This is what researchers call autonomy erosion, the gradual undermining of a person's confidence in their own decision-making capacity. And it doesn't require malice. It doesn't require cruelty. It only requires consistency. The person doing the advising usually never sees this cost, not because they're indifferent to it, but because they're operating from a framework where offering guidance is love, where intervening is care, where staying silent in the face of a perceived mistake feels not like respect, but like abandonment. Their silence would feel, to them, like cruelty. And the irony is almost painful. The very behavior designed to create connection consistently produces distance. The more they help, the more the people around them quietly retreat. The more they offer, the more others stop sharing. Not out of ingratitude, out of self-protection. Because being perpetually instructed eventually trains people to stop asking and stop revealing. Over time, the chronic unsolicited advisor often finds themselves surrounded by people who seem closed off, who share less, who keep conversations carefully surface level. They interpret this as the world being cold, or ungrateful, or resistant to growth. They rarely identify it as the natural consequence of a dynamic they themselves created. Psychologist Murray Bowen, whose work on family systems remains foundational in relational therapy, described this as a lack of differentiation. The inability to allow others to be separate, autonomous individuals with their own valid inner worlds. For the undifferentiated person, other people's choices feel strangely personal, almost threatening. Someone else's different decision implies that the advisor's way might not be the only way. And for someone whose sense of competence is among their only reliable sources of self-worth, that implication is genuinely destabilizing. They grieve, quietly, the version of themselves who might have learned to sit with uncertainty, who might have discovered that love doesn't require instruction, who might have found that they are worth something not because of what they know, but simply because of who they are. Their survival became expertise. Their anxiety became advice. Their longing for control became a pattern that cost them, slowly and invisibly, the very closeness they were trying to build. Tough but certain, generous but suffocating. Caring but unable to simply be present, they've spent their whole lives trying to earn their place in rooms they were always allowed to occupy. And somehow, despite it all, they're still showing up, still trying, in the only language their nervous system learned, to say, "I love you. I'm scared. Please don't leave." If any part of this felt familiar, whether you recognize someone you know, or quietly saw yourself somewhere in here, they're not broken. And neither are you. This is just what unexamined fear looks like when it puts on a helpful face. Subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into the quiet, complicated psychology that most people feel but never find the words for. I genuinely appreciate having you here.